Some have said I've talked a lot of junk about Auburn football this offseason, so who better to check my work with than Zach Blackerby of Locked On Auburn? Let's talk Tigers versus Tigers right now on Locked On Mizzou.
You are Locked On Mizzou, your daily podcast on the Missouri Tigers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, welcome on into this special crossover edition between Locked On Auburn and Locked On Mizzou. I'm Zach Blackerby with Locked On Auburn. He is John Miller with Locked On Mizzou. It's never too early to look at the top games coming up at this upcoming football season. And John, before we clicked record, I mean, this is a big one. Both teams agree. Probably not either team's biggest game of the season, but it's certainly top three, top four when you look at this. When Auburn heads to Columbia, Missouri, later this season on October 19th, this is a game where, like, if Auburn needs to overachieve, they need to win. If Missouri needs to kind of keep this momentum that you guys have built behind Eli Drinkwitz, if y'all need to keep that momentum going, you need to fend off the Auburn Tigers. What's the Mizzou side of this when you kind of go through the schedule and you look at this game?
I think you kind of said it. Obviously, Auburn is a huge program, big-time name, bigger name historically than Missouri, and yet Missouri sitting here in a position where beating the Auburn Tigers is kind of a must-win game. If the Tigers are going to meet their goals, which to me is making the 12-team playoff, I don't see how you can lose to Auburn and make that happen.
Right. Yeah, and I think that kind of shows where both of these teams are, because Missouri's in that mindset of, okay, we need to make the college football playoff this year, the 12-team playoff. And Auburn's kind of been this like, okay, can we win 8 games? Can we win 9 games? Can lightning strike and maybe something better happen if, Auburn's offense is able to put everything together? But John, I'm sure you get this a ton from folks talking about Missouri from the national level and maybe even from around the SEC, maybe even internally. I don't know. But last year, I kind of kept waiting for the wheels to fall off for Missouri, and they just didn't. And it's
Right.
like at the end of it, and their bowl game, it's like, okay, yeah, this is a good team. What Eli Drinkwitz has built, Missouri has arrived.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think Missouri was for real last season, and after a really weird 2022 game against Auburn, that was kind of the season for Missouri, a team that maybe could have broken out a little bit in 2022, but just could not quite win the close games. Some of that was luck. Some of that was, frankly, just Missouri was better in 2023. You had your quarterback, Brady Cook, with a full year of experience under his belt. Obviously, he's coming back in 2024. Like you said, it's going to take some time for a program like Missouri, especially with a new coach, to get where it needs to be. And what I'm curious, Zach, with Hugh Freeze in year 2 here, I think Auburn's in a really interesting spot because traditionally Auburn has really high expectations. Sometimes they meet them. Every once in a while they'll win a national championship. But then other times it seems like their fans maybe get a little bit too hot on expectations. Does that make sense? I guess what I'm saying is I see a lot of great recruiting so far from Hugh Freeze. Do you really think this is the year for Auburn to break through, though, or is it maybe a year 3 thing?
I think it's a year 3 thing, John. And, I think when you look ahead, I mean, the SEC schedules, you play the same teams, it's just flipped. And I think Auburn's chances of beating Missouri are better when it's in Auburn than it is when they go to Columbia. And I think also, Auburn's 3 toughest opponents this year and the following year, they go to Georgia, they go to Missouri, and they go to Bama. And then obviously that switches the following season. So to me, I think both from a talent standpoint and an opportunity regarding the schedule, I do think the breakout year will be 2025, but that's not the way this team is thinking, right? That's not the way Hugh Freeze is thinking. From a recruiting standpoint, they're hitting the ground running. They're getting talent. Auburn has elite SEC talent in a few positions. The issue is they're 18 years old right now.
Right.
And so how much of an impact can they make? And you guys have seen, what special, talented receivers can do with what Luther's been able to do. Does Auburn have that with Cam Coleman? And they certainly could. And by the time, Auburn goes to Missouri, like he'll have his feet set up under him, and maybe he will be emerging and ascending potentially being one of these top, talented receivers in this league. But a lot of it's just got to come together for Auburn. And I think there's going to be a few positions where there's going to be some mismatches for Auburn to possibly win some of these toss-up games, John. But to me, I don't know if it is this year, but certainly I think 2025 Auburn is a team to watch.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with you. And really, that's the thing to me. Correct me if I'm wrong, Zach. I think recruiting kind of has held Auburn back in recent years a little bit. And if Hugh Freeze is going to really put it, I think he had a top 10 class his first year, correct me if I'm wrong, probably going to follow it up with something at least as good, maybe even better. They're looking to possibly flip the number one player in the country right now in Juju Lewis, quarterback committed to USC. And I mean, if that's all happening, if I'm an Auburn fan, to be perfectly honest, I almost don't care what happens in year two to some extent. Now, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but I'm just saying you go 6-6, 7-5, you're saying, hey, well, maybe 8, maybe 9. It's okay if you win 6 this year. It really is. If you're going to keep recruiting that way, if the guys out there are still playing hard for Hugh Freeze, I'm just telling Auburn fans from my perspective, just looking at that recruiting, it makes me nervous as a Missouri fan. I hope you Auburn fans start to get impatient with Hugh Freeze this year, because if you are patient, if that team sticks together, I think it's probably going to work out in the long run.
The patience thing throughout the Auburn fan base, it's been a mix of a few things. One, I mean, I guess it kind of started with Gus Malzahn, just the, constantly winning 8 or 9 games. And it's like, okay, well, Georgia and Alabama, they're winning a ton. Like, why can't you catch up with, your 2 biggest rivals? You're consistently recruiting inside the top 10, but like, you're not finishing with a top 10 product. What's going on here? And so the Auburn administration, they got impatient and they pulled the plug on Gus Malzahn, which, probably was the right move. I don't think the following hire is what they should have done. I don't think Brian Harsin is anywhere close to as good of a coach as what Gus Malzahn was, but it is what it is there. And, Harsin just set the program back a decade with the lack of what he wanted to do. And so Hugh Freeze inherited a really crummy situation, and I think he's made the most of it in his short amount of time here. It's just going to take time. I mean, this isn't Ole Miss where he wants to rebuild it via the portal. He wants to rebuild it via the high school ranks, and he's still having to patch holes in the portal, but all in all, he wants to recruit his guys from the high school level and develop them. I think that's the way you kind of do this from a long-term perspective. John, I want to ask you what I think the biggest mismatch is with this Auburn and Missouri matchup. Let's touch on that next, if you don't mind, right here on the special crossover edition of Locked On Auburn and Locked On Mizzou. Today's show is brought to you by our friends at LinkedIn Jobs. John, you know how easy it is to use LinkedIn Jobs. If you're a small business, it doesn't make sense why you wouldn't be using LinkedIn Jobs to find your top talent.
No doubt about that. I have a small business myself. We've used LinkedIn Jobs before. We're experts at a lot of stuff, mostly dancing, but hiring, that's where you got to check out LinkedIn Jobs. They'll do it for you, and they'll do it like a professional.
Yep, and they know small businesses, they're wearing so many hats, so they want to make the hiring process as easy as possible for you. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/lockedoncollege. That is linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. John, I think the biggest mismatch between Auburn and Missouri when they play on October 19th in Columbia is quarterback. You mentioned Brady Cook. Peyton Thorne, the jury's still kind of out on him. We don't know how much he was really set up to succeed a year ago, but from the Mizzou perspective, when you look at the power rankings, I guess, of quarterbacks in the SEC, you guys got to feel like your dude's towards the top.
I think that's absolutely right. And it's hard for me to necessarily rank those top guys off the top of my head, but I think the real point there is I think the conventional wisdom is Carson Beck would probably be number one right at this moment. Let's just say he is.
Sure.
I don't think there's a huge gap between the talent that Brady Cook brings to the table and Carson Beck. Now, you can say he plays for a better team. I wouldn't argue with you. I think Georgia's got to be considered number one right now in my book, but that's just my humble opinion. But yeah, I'm right there with you. And frankly, I think nationally, if anything, I think Brady Cook is still probably a little bit underrated because he's not popping up on any he's not getting a lot of NFL hype at this point or anything like that. But I think just in terms of college football, he's absolutely up there. And that Missouri offense in general just has a ton of returning production at receiver, offensive line. They've plugged a couple holes through the portal, I think, very effectively in the line as well. So if you're worried about the quarterback position, that's probably a good thing for Missouri because they have a lot more questions on the defensive side of the ball than the offensive side of the ball.
So if Auburn's going to pull off this upset, and once again, this is so far away, we don't even know what these teams are going to really look like. And I mean, teams may not even be done in the transfer portal. We'll see. But what do you anticipate the weakness of Missouri being? Like, what does Auburn need to do to capitalize on that?
Well, I think Auburn's going to have to score. I think that's the big thing. I think Missouri is almost, again, barring injury, who the heck knows in mid-October exactly what these rosters are going to look like.
Sure, yeah.
Missouri was fortunate with injuries last year. Hopefully that'll happen again from my perspective, obviously. But putting all that aside, to me, it's obviously defense. I can see a scenario where Missouri regresses a fair bit on defense next season. Not only is there a fair amount of personnel change, especially at the defensive back spot on the outside at corner, in my opinion. That's your biggest question mark. But also, of course, Blake Baker, Missouri's defensive coordinator the past couple seasons, moved on to LSU where his wife is an alum and all that good stuff. They paid him $2.5 million and all that. So to me, if Missouri does regress a little bit defensively, maybe they're just outside of the playoff, that kind of deal. I think their new defensive coordinator, Corey Batoon, is kind of the obvious whipping boy / scapegoat there.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't know if Auburn's going to be able to capitalize on that or not. This is the best offensive roster Auburn's had since 2017, I think. And that's the year that they played for the SEC championship game that they lost against Georgia. But as far as just having options in the passing attack, Auburn finally has that. They have an offensive line that I feel pretty good about. And then, a lot of their returning running backs were super effective a year ago. And so we'll certainly see what happens there. But all in all, like the offensive roster appears to be solid. It's just scheme and quarterback play. And they were both so inconsistent a year ago. Auburn made changes to their offensive coaching staff. And we're all assuming Hugh Freeze is going to take a larger part of this. Because when you think about Hugh Freeze, you think about recruiting and offense. And He really only recruited a year ago. And so now he's going to be more involved in the offense. I guess that's going to help Peyton Thorne out. I guess it's going to help the passing game. If it doesn't, I think there's more conversations we need to have, internally at Auburn. But on paper, it makes sense how Auburn would be able to capitalize on that. But until they do it, John, I'm going to be a little hesitant.
Sure. Here's one thing I actually heard. A little birdie that I have that was around the Auburn practices this spring told me that, Auburn was a little bit behind where he thought he expected, like some of the installs that they were doing. He felt like it was kind of rudimentary for the point where Auburn is year 2 here. What exactly were you seeing? Was that an observation you had as well, or is that just this person?
Yeah, I don't think that's a crazy take. Now, I do wonder, like, what proper expectations are. I mean, this is a situation where, okay, you bring your quarterback back, but okay, you've got your tight end, Rivaldo Fairweather, who led Auburn in receiving yards a year ago. And then, Jay Fair, who's your other leading receiver, he was hurt for a big chunk of spring, and then he ultimately transferred out afterwards. And then the rest of it's new guys. Robert Lewis, you brought in from Georgia State. Sam Jackson, who played quarterback at Cal a year ago and transferred over. So he's learning not only a new offense, but a new position all in all. And then the rest of your freshmen or the rest of your receivers are freshmen. And so I don't know what proper expectations should have been. It would be my pushback to that. And so I think when you bring in all this new talent, I do think it raises the ceiling of what Auburn could do offensively. But there's also more room, I think, for things to not go as well as you would want. So I think you kind of risk some of the upside for stability when you make moves like that. But when you look at Auburn's offense last year, what were you going to do? You can't just sit still and do nothing. So
Yeah, I think the take there was more of just an observation and not really a criticism of Hugh Freeze, just more of observation of, hey, I think Hugh Freeze will probably do okay at Auburn eventually. It just may not be the breakout year in year two. That's just kind of what I'm thinking right now anyway.
I don't think that's a crazy take at all, John. I don't think it's a crazy take at all. And to me, I think when you look at what needs to happen this season, it's I think you just need to kind of show that, hey, a modern day offense in college football can exist at Auburn again.
Yeah.
And, I think they like their young quarterbacks that are behind Peyton Thorne. And then, you mentioned Juju Lewis. I think Auburn's in a great spot to land Juju Lewis when it's all said and done. I think the future of the position's fine. It's just, have you put enough around Peyton Thorne to capitalize and be able to score against teams like Mizzou this year? So
what's the expectation on the other side of the ball for Auburn then defensively?
I think it's gonna be better. I think Auburn's defense is gonna be I think it's gonna be solid. I left spring very worried about the defensive line. And then they go out and add 3 really solid defensive line players. And so last week we did a show on Locked On Auburn ranking the 5 transfer defensive linemen. They went out and added 5 guys on the defensive front, John. And so, they totally revitalized it. Some of those guys will start, some of them won't. And the guys that won't start is because you got a 5-star in Keldrick Falk playing defensive ends. So to me, they really beefed that up. You're returning your linebackers. And then I think the defensive back room is probably the most, it's the deepest room. It's the deepest room on this team. So if Auburn's going to beat some teams, I think they're going to have to keep them from scoring and prevent shootouts. And I think a matchup like Mizzou, that's going to be crucial.
Interesting. Well, I think, it's interesting. You've got on your side there on your tees too large of a spread. And, what is the spread right now over at FanDuel? Do you have it in front of you?
I think it's 7.
7. Okay. Honestly, I thought it was 10 or so. So I'm going to say no. If anything, I'd probably jump on that if I were a Missouri fan at 7, or just somebody likes to make money. I might actually jump on that a little early because I don't know. I think by the time we get to mid-October, I think Missouri's probably a 2-score favorite there, in my opinion. That's just how I'm feeling right now.
I think it'll shift too. Yeah. Let's touch on that in just a moment, if you don't mind. Right here on the special crossover edition of Locked On Auburn and Locked On Mizzou. John just mentioned them. FanDuel is the best place to wager on all of your sports action. It's winner take all in the NBA and NHL. And FanDuel's giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. Auburn's win total on FanDuel is 7.5, John. And I think it's perfect. It really depends on the day when you ask me that question. Right now I'm thinking over. But next week that may drop. What is the win total for Mizzou on FanDuel?
9.5 at last time I checked. And again, that's right about the number, I think. They're pretty good at this, I'll tell you that.
Yeah, they're good at what they do. So if you feel passionate about either of those one way or the other, and heck, this game's probably going to decide which team goes over and which team goes under. I think it's got a real shot at that. It's a huge game. So right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, and more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to make every playoff shot count. Yeah, John, I think I'm with you. I think this spread is going to move in Missouri's favor the closer we get to it. I don't think Mizzou's schedule is very tough. They've got that road trip to Texas A&M 2 weeks before they host Auburn. And if they win that game, they're going to be a perfect 6-0 hosting Auburn. And I just think Vegas is going to be all over that.
Right. Yeah, I'm with you. And what's interesting about Missouri's schedule to me is the 2 toughest games, certainly on the road, are, as you said, Texas A&M, and of course we're playing the Crimson Tide on the road as well. Both of those teams with new coaches. So honestly, as I've been saying, Zach, I'm kind of curious what you think about this, but I think Alabama's ceiling for this season is as high as it's ever been. I do think the floor is a little bit lower with a lot of new personnel, with a new coaching staff. What are you hearing about the Crimson Tide right now?
You got to think this is the most vulnerable they've been
in 15 years.
Yeah, 15 years, 10 years, something like that. And it's nothing against DeBoer. It's just he's not Nick Saban.
Right.
And, the odds of him becoming as great of a coach as Nick Saban was, it's low. It's certainly low, but it's still Alabama. It's still a brand. It's still got lots of talent and lots of resources. And, DeBoer's won everywhere he's been. And
Sure.
that's why Alabama wanted him. So to me, I also think Alabama's got one of the tougher schedules they've had in a hot minute because they play teams like Missouri and Georgia, and they even go up to Wisconsin, which I think is a little odd, and that's kind of tricky. So I think Missouri's got a shot against Alabama. I mean, right now I would pick Alabama over Mizzou, but I think Mizzou certainly got a shot. Then you mentioned the other kind of big game on y'all's schedule, Oklahoma. I'm not high on Oklahoma this year. I don't get it. I don't fully get what everybody else is saying about the Sooners.
Yeah, well, expand on that a little bit because I think I'm going there with you a little bit. Don't get me wrong, Oklahoma was good last year, but new league, new quarterback. By the way, why did the quarterback transfer to Oregon? I mean, there's some question marks there to me.
Yeah, new quarterback is huge. They're replacing a lot of guys on their offensive line. Obviously, that's going to be
one who went to Missouri too, by the way, Caden Green. So that's kind of a trade that we won because we didn't give anything up. It's like it's like the Yankees signing a free agent from the Red Sox, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think that's probably a good win for y'all. So I don't know, man. I think all the pressure is also on Oklahoma too, and my listeners are probably rolling their eyes like, "Oh, here he goes again with this." But I think Oklahoma's in a tricky situation with their schedule. Their first SEC game, they host Tennessee, and I think all the pressure is going to be on Oklahoma and Norman, and I think Tennessee's going to win that game. I think Tennessee is better than Oklahoma. Then they turn around and go to Auburn, and they've got to be thinking in their brain, what if we go 0-2? Right. Everyone is going to make fun of us if we go 0-2. We've been begging to get into the SEC for forever. It's finally here, and oh my goodness, we start 0-2. I just think all the pressure's there. Then they play Texas after a bye week. I think Texas wins that game. And just what happens mentally when you've got a new quarterback, you're in a new conference, and you're the butt of every joke because you start 0-3. And I think that's a very real scenario. Even if you go 1-2 and you lose to Texas and you lose to Tennessee, to me, I just think it's a lot. I think it's a lot of pressure on Oklahoma.
Well, your listeners may be tired of that, but I'm loving it because this is the first time I've heard it. I think it's a brilliant point, and as a fan of Missouri, I have very, very vivid memories of what it was like to play the first SEC season in 2012. And for Missouri, it was kind of fun. It was almost a celebration. And it wasn't until, next season, 2013, the Tigers really broke out, obviously had a huge season, won the East the next two seasons. But that first year in 2012, was a little bit disappointing. Missouri had some injuries at the quarterback position on the offensive line, and it wasn't Missouri's greatest year, but it wasn't like there wasn't the pressure. Missouri is not the big red machine of Oklahoma from years past in this, glitz and glamour kind of program, blue blood kind of program. So I agree with you completely. There is a whole different level of pressure on Oklahoma in 2024 than there was on Missouri, for example, a dozen years ago, or even Texas A&M. It's much more like when Nebraska showed up in the Big Ten, and when they weren't immediately, dominating like they wanted to. Guess what? A lot of Missouri fans were making fun of Nebraska too.
Yeah, I think there's a chance that Oklahoma loses in this transition from the Big 12 to the SEC. I think Texas makes a ton of sense, and some of it's timing, right? Like Texas's roster is better right now than Oklahoma's is. But I just think them coming into the SEC, I'm not fully sold on their coaching situation. We'll see certainly what happens. But yeah, I'm not super high on Oklahoma right now. So maybe I'm ignorant to a few things, but we'll see what happens. We'll see what happens. But John, I guess let's give our way too early picks for Auburn, Missouri. I do think Missouri wins this game. We'll certainly see how both teams develop, but you said two scores. I'm thinking, 7-10 points, something like that when it's all said and done.
Yeah, I'm thinking something like Missouri 28, Auburn 17, maybe something like that. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'm
that's
not
reasonable.
seeing like a shootout or anything like that off the top of my head. I think, like you say, Auburn has some talent offensively, and you like their talent, defensively, offensively. They have talent on both sides of the ball, is the point. But I just think
Right.
Missouri has overall the better roster, certainly the more experienced roster. Also, this will be year 5 for Drinkwitz versus year 2 for Freeze. I think that stuff does matter quite a
It
bit.
does. I agree. I agree. John, for all the Auburn folks tuning in, how can people check out everything you've got going on?
Well, if you ever want to know what's going on in Mizzou country, get behind enemy lines, got to check out Locked On Mizzou wherever you get podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, SiriusXM app, and follow me anywhere on social media at Locked On Mizzou as well.
Yeah, do the same with Locked On Auburn. Please like the video. Please subscribe to both of our channels, and we will see you tomorrow. This has been a special crossover edition of Locked On Auburn and Locked On Mizzou.